Close your eyes and picture the soft rustling of papyrus scrolls being carefully unrolled, the faint smell of cedar oil and lamp smoke mingling in the air, the gentle whisper of a stylus across parchment. Around you, the stone walls hold a profound silence, a quietness so complete it feels almost like a living thing, wrapping itself around your shoulders like a warm linen cloth. Somewhere in the darkness, a scribe's breath comes slowly and steadily. The floor beneath your feet is smooth and cool. You are not alone, yet you have never felt so peacefully surrounded by the presence of something vast and immeasurable. In the year 280 before the Common Era, in the sprawling city of Alexandria at the mouth of the Nile River, a vision began to take shape that would echo through the centuries to come. Ptolemy II, a young ruler of the Hellenistic world, inherited more than a kingdom from his father. He inherited a dream of gathering all the knowledge that humanity had ever managed to inscribe onto papyrus and parchment. The waters of the Mediterranean flowed entirely against the white stone of Alexandria's harbor, and somewhere in the ordered geometry of streets and buildings, a space was being prepared that would become not merely a library, but a temple to human understanding itself. The founding of the Great Library did not announce itself with fanfare or grand declarations. Instead, it grew quietly, methodically, with the same patience that a river takes in carving its way through stone. Ptolemy understood something profound about the nature of knowledge, that it required sanctuary, that scrolls needed protection from the ravages of heat and humidity, and the passage of time itself. He appointed scholars and librarians whose names would largely fade from history, yet whose careful work would preserve the intellectual heritage of three distinct civilizations: Greek, Egyptian, and beyond. The structure itself, located within the Brutian district near the royal palaces, was not merely a building but an entire complex of interconnected rooms and reading chambers. High ceilings allowed air to circulate gently through the spaces where knowledge was stored. Wooden shelves, constructed from timber brought across the sea, lined the walls in careful rows. The walls themselves were painted in soft colors, not the garish hues of the marketplace, but the restful tones of sage and ochre and pale cream, colors that seemed to absorb the glare of the Mediterranean sun and transform it into something gentle and diffused. Among the first acquisitions were the great works of Greek philosophy and drama. Aristotle's own library, it is said, was brought to Alexandria, though this story has been disputed by scholars across many centuries. Nevertheless, the works of the great thinkers arrived in steady processions: the natural philosophy of Empedocles, the geometric proofs of Euclid, the medical observations of Hippocrates. Each scroll was received as though it were a precious guest arriving at a residence of honor. And indeed, in the vision of Ptolemy, this is precisely what they were. Imagine now the interior spaces of the library as it matured across the first decades of its existence. The cataloging system that emerged was nothing short of revolutionary, a methodical ordering of human knowledge into categories and subcategories that would not be significantly improved upon for more than 2,000 years. This organizational impulse arose not from abstract philosophy, but from a deeply practical need. With scrolls numbering in the hundreds of thousands, One could not simply wander the shelves hoping to stumble upon a required text. The scholars and librarians who worked within these spaces developed systems of organization based partly on the models of earlier archives in Mesopotamia and Egypt, yet refined and expanded with a sophistication born of the Hellenistic age. Scrolls were cataloged according to their subject matter, their origin, their author, and their physical dimensions. Lists were maintained on papyrus sheets, arranged in orderly columns with the kind of meticulous handwriting that suggested both discipline and a deep respect for the knowledge being preserved. The reading rooms themselves were arranged according to a logic that encouraged both focused study and serendipitous discovery. A scholar seeking information on mathematics would find himself in proximity to works on music theory and harmony, for the ancients understood that these disciplines were intimately connected, that the proportions that governed musical intervals were the same proportions that governed the movements of the stars. Similarly, works on natural history were shelved near those on medicine, recognizing that an understanding of plants and animals was essential to understanding the healing arts. The work of cataloging was itself an act of profound intellectual engagement. The scribes and scholars who undertook this labor were not merely copying down titles and authors. They were reading, absorbing, and assimilating the content of each work. In this way, the library functioned as a kind of extended collective mind, with each person who worked there becoming part of a larger organism devoted to the preservation and understanding of human knowledge. Special collections were established within the greater whole. There was a section dedicated to mathematical texts, another to works of poetry and drama, another to the practical sciences of engineering and architecture. The medical collection was particularly extensive and detailed, reflecting both the practical importance of healing knowledge and the particular prominence of Alexandria as a center of medical learning and innovation. Works on agriculture were carefully preserved, for Egypt's prosperity depended upon understanding the rhythms of the Nile and the cultivation of its fertile lands. The daily rhythms of the library unfolded with a constancy that might seem monotonous to the modern ear, yet which held within it a profound poetry. Each morning as the sun rose over Alexandria, the heavy wooden doors of the library were opened by attendants whose feet had trod these same passages for decades. The air within had cooled during the night, and there was a freshness to it, a sense of restoration and renewal. Dust motes drifted through the shafts of light that began to penetrate the carefully designed windows. The scribes arrived in the early hours, moving through the corridors with the quiet efficiency of those who had performed the same tasks 10,000 times. Their robes were practical, unmarked by the dust and ash that their work inevitably created. In their hands were the tools of their craft, the quills and styluses, the pots of ink made from oak gall and copper sulfate, the carefully prepared cutting boards where papyrus sheets were laid out for inscription. Some of these men were slaves, others were paid workers of considerable skill, and a few were scholars in their own right who had chosen to dedicate their lives to the copying and preservation of texts. The process of copying a manuscript was not a swift affair, nor was it undertaken lightly. A lengthy philosophical treatise might require weeks or months of careful work, with multiple scribes sometimes sharing the labor. The most valuable or particularly fragile works were copied by the most skilled hands, those whose own training had taken years to complete. These scribes had learned not merely to reproduce letters and words, but to understand the content they were copying well enough to maintain consistency in meaning across the long expanse of a document. Preservation itself was an art form requiring constant vigilance and deep knowledge. The Egyptian climate, despite its general dryness, presented particular challenges. The proximity of the Mediterranean meant that salt air could damage papyrus, causing brittleness and deterioration. Humidity that rose with the annual flooding of the Nile needed to be managed. Temperature fluctuations, though not extreme, still posed a threat to the delicate materials that held human knowledge. The librarians developed techniques for protecting their precious collections that were both innovative and gentle. Scrolls were kept in containers made of cedar wood, which provided both structural support and a natural resistance to insects and decay. These containers were stored in chambers where the air was carefully regulated through a system of channels and ventilation that took advantage of the natural breezes flowing from the harbor. Some texts were kept in oil, sealed against the corrosive effects of time. Others were wrapped in linen cloth and stored in dry chambers away from any source of dampness. The work of acquisition continued steadily throughout the library's long existence. Egypt's wealth and Alexandria's prominence as a port city meant that the library could afford to purchase scrolls at considerable prices, and Ptolemy's successors maintained a vigorous acquisition program. Merchants arriving at the harbor knew that any Greek texts they carried might be of interest to the library's agents. Entire collections belonging to private scholars or monasteries would occasionally be purchased wholesale, bringing with them the accumulated learning of generations. To understand the nature of the Library of Alexandria is to understand something about the character of the men and women who devoted their lives to its care. These were not merely functionaries, though the work required organization and attention to detail of the most meticulous kind. Rather, they were individuals animated by a profound conviction that human knowledge, once inscribed in writing, had transcended the fragility of a single human life and entered into a kind of permanence that approached the eternal. The head librarians, of whom we know the names of several, were figures of considerable importance in Alexandria. They had access to Ptolemy and his successors. They commanded significant budgets, and they shaped policy regarding what sorts of works would be collected and how they would be organized. Zenodotus of Ephesus, the first and perhaps most influential of these great librarians, arrived around 285 before the Common Era and immediately began the work of creating order from the considerable but somewhat chaotic collection that had been accumulated during the library's early years. Zenodotus undertook the monumental task of cataloging Greek literature, creating systematic lists of works organized by author and by subject. He is credited with the production of the Pinax, a comprehensive bibliography that listed the contents of the library and which became the model for all subsequent library catalogs in the ancient world. Creating such a work was not a matter of sitting at a desk with pen in hand, but rather a process of physically visiting each section of the library, examining each scroll, reading portions of it to understand its content, and then carefully recording its particulars in systematic lists. Following Xenodotus came Callimachus, a poet and scholar of such remarkable learning that his own works would themselves be preserved and studied for centuries. Callimachus expanded the cataloging system and began to refine the organization of knowledge in ways that reflected not merely administrative practicality, but something approaching artistic vision. He understood that the arrangement of knowledge on the shelves of a library was itself a form of expression, a way of revealing the relationships between different disciplines and bodies of learning. Other names echo down through history with less clarity but no less significance. Eratosthenes, who served as librarian sometime around 245 before the Common Era, was himself one of the most remarkable scholars of the ancient world. A mathematician, astronomer, geographer, and poet whose own work was preserved in the library, he helped to oversee. His measurement of the Earth's circumference, based on geometric principles and observation of shadows at different latitudes, represented the kind of sophisticated reasoning that the library sought to preserve and promote. Apollonius of Rhodes, another librarian and scholar, was perhaps more celebrated in his own time as a poet than as an administrator. Yet his work in organizing the library's collections was no less important to the institution's success. He brought to the work of cataloging a sensitivity to language and meaning that elevated it beyond mere clerical labor. Under his direction, cross-references were created between related works. Annotations were added to clarify points of particular difficulty or importance, and the library began to function not merely as a repository, but as an instrument of learning and understanding. Across the 3 centuries of the Library of Alexandria's operation as a unified institution, its collections grew to encompass an estimated 400,000 to 900,000 scrolls. The exact figure remains shrouded in the mists of history and the uncertainties of ancient sources. These numbers are perhaps difficult to grasp in an age accustomed to thinking in digital terms, yet they represented an accumulation of human knowledge so vast that no single person, no matter how learned, could hope to read more than a fraction of it in a lifetime. The mathematical and scientific collections occupied spaces of considerable prominence within the library. Here were preserved the elements of Euclid, that towering achievement of geometric proof and logical ordering that would remain the standard mathematical text for 2,000 years. Alongside these were works on arithmetic, on the properties of numbers, on the theory of proportion. The Pythagorean tradition was represented extensively, with works exploring the relationships between mathematics and music, between numerical ratios and harmony. The works of natural history and observation were likewise substantial. Descriptions of animals and plants from across the known world filled scroll after scroll. These were not merely poetic or mythological accounts, but careful observations made by travelers and naturalists who understood that close attention to the physical world revealed patterns and principles that illuminated understanding. Works on astronomy preserved the observations and calculations of those who watched the heavens, seeking to understand the motions of the stars and planets according to geometric and mathematical principles. Medicine and anatomy held a particularly important place in the library's collections, reflecting Alexandria's prominence as a center of medical learning and innovation. Here were preserved the great works of the Hippocratic tradition, along with newer texts that built upon and refined those teachings. Descriptions of surgical techniques, discussions of the properties of medicinal plants, treatises on the nature of disease and its treatment, all of these were gathered and preserved. Some of these works were based on systematic observation and experimentation, representing the kinds of empirical inquiry that would later be recognized as the foundation of modern science. The philosophical works occupied shelves that seemed to stretch endlessly, encompassing not merely the writings of Plato and Aristotle, but the works of pre-Socratic thinkers whose ideas had shaped the development of Western thought. Here were the fragments of Heraclitus, the logical demonstrations of the Stoics, the ethical teachings of the Epicureans. The library preserved competing and contradictory philosophical traditions, reflecting a commitment to the preservation of human thought in all its diversity and complexity. The literary collections, the dramas and poems, occupied spaces filled with a kind of particular reverence. The great tragedies of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides were preserved with the understanding that these were not merely entertainments, but profound meditations on the human condition. The comedies of Aristophanes, with their satirical humor and political commentary, were recognized as valuable records of their times. The epic poems attributed to Homer, which had shaped Greek cultural identity, were studied intensively, with multiple copies preserved in different states and with various annotations and scholarly apparatus. Historical works formed another substantial collection. Chronicles of events, biographies of important figures, accounts of wars and political upheavals, all of these were gathered and preserved. These texts served not merely as entertainment or curiosity, but as records through which contemporary and future generations could understand the development of human civilization. The librarians understood that preserving history was a form of ensuring that the lessons of the past would be available to inform the future. Within the vast collections of the Library of Alexandria, individual scrolls represented not merely information, but narrative threads woven into the great tapestry of human knowledge and experience. Consider for a moment the physical reality of these objects. Papyrus sheets glued together in strips, sometimes reaching lengths of 30 or 40 feet, carefully wound around wooden rods. The ink that marked them had been applied by human hands, hands belonging to individuals whose names have largely been forgotten, yet whose work has preserved the thoughts and observations of those who lived in antiquity. One of the most celebrated acquisitions was the collection of the works of Aristotle, the great philosopher and naturalist of the 4th century before the Common Era. Aristotle had established his own school in Athens, the Lyceum, and had accumulated a personal library of considerable proportions. When Aristotle's successor, Theophrastus, eventually sold the collection, it found its way to Alexandria, where it was incorporated into the Great Library with considerable ceremony and appreciation. These texts represented not merely abstract philosophical reasoning, but detailed observations of natural phenomena, classifications of animals and plants, descriptions of their behaviors and characteristics. The plays of the great Greek dramatists existed in multiple copies, some dating back centuries before the library's founding. Scholars worked carefully to establish which of multiple versions represented the most accurate text, examining different copies and attempting to reconstruct the original intention of the author. This work of textual criticism was meticulous and time-consuming, requiring not merely reading ability but profound knowledge of language, grammar, and the conventions of the dramatic tradition. Medical texts existed in various stages of development and refinement. The Hippocratic writings, a collection of medical treatises traditionally attributed to the ancient physician Hippocrates, were among the most carefully preserved and studied works. Later physicians and medical scholars had added annotations and commentaries, creating layers of knowledge and understanding that accumulated across generations. A single copy of an important medical text might bear the notes and markings of dozens of different readers and scholars across centuries. The preservation of poetic works represented a particular kind of reverence. The lyric poets, Pindar, Sappho, Alcaeus, were represented in the library by multiple copies. Sappho's 9 books of poetry, a collection of considerable length, were among the treasures of the collection, though by the time of the library's founding, some of her works were already becoming difficult to locate. The librarians understood that poetry was not merely ornamental language, but a profound expression of human emotion and observation that deserved preservation. Works of geography and travel literature occupied their own sections, representing humanity's expanding knowledge of the world beyond Greece. Accounts of journeys to Egypt and beyond, descriptions of the customs and characteristics of distant peoples, maps and itineraries. These texts serve to expand the mental horizons of those who studied them. They preserved knowledge that would otherwise remain locked in the memories of individual travelers, accessible only through word of mouth across single lifetimes. The collection included as well the mathematical and astronomical works of the Hellenistic period, treatises that pushed the boundaries of human understanding regarding the nature of the cosmos and the principles that governed it. These works represented not merely the accumulation of ancient knowledge, but the active advancement of human understanding through mathematical reasoning and careful observation. They represented the living tradition of scholarship that the library sought to preserve and promote. If the storage chambers and shelves of the Library of Alexandria represented the heart of the institution, then the reading rooms and scholarly spaces represented its soul. Here, in chambers illuminated by carefully positioned windows and supplemented by oil lamps in the cooler months and darker hours, scholars gathered to study, to contemplate, and to create new knowledge through their engagement with the preserved texts. The sounds that filled these spaces were gentle, the whisper of papyrus being unrolled, the soft scratch of styluses on papyrus or parchment, the measured breathing of minds engaged in deep concentration. A scholar arriving at the library for a day of study would enter spaces designed to promote focus and calm. Tables of appropriate height were positioned to provide comfortable surfaces for reading and writing. The lighting, while perhaps dim by modern standards, was carefully optimized to reduce eye strain while preserving the fragile scrolls from excessive exposure to intense light. The air within these chambers was kept at a consistent temperature and humidity, the result of careful architectural design and the tireless work of maintenance staff, whose names have not survived in the historical record. The librarians themselves often served as guides and mentors to visiting scholars. A researcher seeking information on a particular topic might explain their needs to a librarian, who would then use his intimate knowledge of the collection to direct the scholar toward relevant materials. In this way, the library functioned as an intellectual community, with knowledge flowing not merely from texts to readers, but between the minds of those engaged in shared pursuit of understanding. Some scholars came to the library for weeks or months, working through particular subjects with meticulous care. A mathematician might spend an entire season studying the various texts available on geometry and number theory, comparing different approaches and building upon their understanding. A medical scholar might work through the entire collection of medical writings, carefully noting areas of agreement and disagreement, considering how newer observations might refine or extend older teachings. The library attracted scholars from across the Mediterranean world. Some came with royal patronage or sponsorship from wealthy patrons. Others arrived with little more than their own intellectual determination, seeking access to texts that could not be found elsewhere. Alexandria's prominence as a center of learning meant that the most dedicated scholars of the age were drawn there, creating an intellectual community of remarkable richness and diversity. Within these scholarly spaces, new knowledge was created through engagement with preserved knowledge. A botanist studying the descriptions of plants in natural history texts might make connections that the original author had not perceived. A mathematician reading the geometric proofs of earlier scholars might see possibilities for extension or refinement. A physician comparing the observations of Hippocrates with more recent medical writings might arrive at new insights regarding the nature of disease and treatment. The reading rooms were not merely quiet spaces of individual study, however. At times, they became spaces of discussion and debate. Scholars would gather to discuss a particular text, offering different interpretations and raising questions about meaning and significance. These gatherings represented the living continuation of the philosophical and intellectual traditions that the library sought to preserve, ensuring that ancient knowledge remained not a static artifact, but a living, evolving dialogue. Throughout the 3 centuries of the Library of Alexandria's Great Period, from its founding around 280 before the Common Era until the 1st century before the Common Era, the collection continued to grow and evolve. This was not a static achievement, but rather a living, dynamic institution that responded to changes in the intellectual landscape and continuously sought to incorporate new knowledge and understanding. The acquisition strategies of the library evolved over time as well. In its early decades, the library purchased or received as gifts the existing collections of Greek literature and philosophy. As centuries passed, however, the library's agents became increasingly active in seeking out new texts and new translations of existing works. When new mathematical or astronomical treatises appeared, they were sought out and added to the collection. When historians or geographers produced accounts of newly explored lands, these too were incorporated. The library actively commissioned translations as well, recognizing that knowledge valuable to humanity existed in languages beyond Greek. Egyptian texts, both ancient hieroglyphic writings and more contemporary documents, were translated and added to the collection. Jewish texts, including those that would later become known as the Hebrew Bible, were translated into Greek in a version known as the Septuagint, creating a bridge between the Jewish intellectual tradition and the Greek-speaking world. New systems of organization and classification evolved to accommodate the growing and diversifying collection. As knowledge accumulated, as overlaps and connections between different fields of learning became apparent, the librarians continually refined their approaches to cataloging and arrangement. They understood that the way knowledge was organized influenced how it was understood, and they worked to create systems that revealed the relationships and connections between different areas of human understanding. The library's influence on the broader intellectual culture of Alexandria and beyond was profound. The existence of this vast repository of knowledge drew to Alexandria the most ambitious scholars of the age. The city became known as a center of learning unequaled in the ancient world. Young men seeking education came to Alexandria in hopes of gaining access to the library and the communities of scholars that had gathered there. The library also served as a model for other institutions. In other cities throughout the Mediterranean world, rulers and wealthy individuals attempted to establish libraries modeled on Alexandria's example. While none achieved quite the same scale or prominence, these institutions represented the spread of the conviction that knowledge preservation and accessibility was a worthy goal deserving of significant investment and careful attention. The library was not, however, an isolated institution existing in splendid isolation from the broader world. It was deeply embedded in the political and intellectual life of Alexandria and Egypt. It was patronized by the Ptolemaic rulers who drew prestige and glory from its existence. It was connected to the broader networks of trade and communication that linked the Mediterranean world, receiving materials from distant lands and sending scholars and knowledge outward into those same networks. And yet, beneath the grandeur and accomplishment of the Library of Alexandria, there ran a current of fragility and vulnerability that would ultimately lead to its decline and destruction. The very scrolls that the librarians worked so carefully to preserve were, in the end, made of materials that were subject to decay. The papyrus, that remarkable plant product that had enabled the preservation of knowledge for centuries, was nonetheless vulnerable to moisture, heat, insects, and the patient erosion of time itself. The library existed within the political and military context of the ancient Mediterranean world, and that context was ultimately to prove treacherous. Egypt's position as a great power had been challenged by the rise of Rome, and the centuries of the library's operation saw Egypt's political independence gradually eroded. The Ptolemaic rulers who had founded the library and maintained its support became increasingly clients of Rome rather than independent sovereigns. Civil strife and political instability in Egypt threatened the stability of the institution. In the 1st century before the Common Era, Egypt was rent by internal conflicts, with different factions competing for control. The city of Alexandria itself, though magnificent, was not immune to these conflicts. In 48 before the Common Era, during the civil war between Julius Caesar and Pompey, Caesar's forces engaged in naval combat in the harbor of Alexandria, and fires spread through the city, including, it is said, to the library itself. Yet even as these political and military threats loomed, the library continued to function and maintain its collections. The institution proved more resilient than one might have expected, its fundamental importance to the intellectual life of Alexandria and the broader Hellenistic world securing its support and preservation, even through periods of considerable political turmoil. The loss of some materials to the fire of 48 before the Common Era was significant, but not catastrophic. The library's collections had been distributed throughout multiple buildings, providing a kind of insurance against total loss. The transition from Greek to Roman rule, while representing a significant shift in political authority, did not immediately bring an end to the library's operations. Rome itself developed a profound respect for Greek learning and culture, and the preservation of the Library of Alexandria was seen as a service to civilization itself. The library continued to acquire new materials, to maintain its collections, and to serve as a center of learning throughout the period of Roman rule. Yet the character of the institution gradually shifted. The kind of unbounded pursuit of knowledge that had characterized the library in its earliest centuries began to yield to more practical concerns. The library became increasingly focused on medical and technical knowledge, on practical applications of learning, rather than the pure pursuit of understanding for its own sake. The great philosophical and literary works remained, but the energy that had animated their study seemed, to observers of later centuries, to have somewhat diminished. By the 1st century of the Common Era, some accounts suggest that the library was no longer the vibrant intellectual center it had once been. Scholars increasingly established private collections or studied in smaller, more specialized repositories rather than at Alexandria. The library's acquisitions program, once aggressive and ambitious, seems to have become more modest. Yet it would be wrong to speak of immediate decline. The library remained an important institution, and many of its collections remained accessible and were continued to be studied and copied. The Library of Alexandria's decline as a functioning institution did not occur suddenly, but rather gradually, across centuries. The final great gathering and organizing of knowledge within its walls eventually gave way to slow deterioration as the manuscripts aged. The infrastructure required maintenance that was sometimes deferred, and the intellectual energy that had once animated the institution gradually dissipated. Yet the legacy of those 3 centuries of knowledge gathering and preservation extended far beyond the library's own existence. The texts that had been collected, copied, and preserved at Alexandria did not vanish even as the institution itself faded. Many had been copied multiple times, and these copies had spread throughout the Mediterranean world. In monasteries and centers of learning in what would become Europe, scribes continued to copy the texts that had been preserved at Alexandria. In Islamic centers of learning during the medieval period, Arabic translations of these same works were produced and studied, becoming the means through which the knowledge of ancient Greece was eventually preserved and transmitted back to the European Renaissance. The cataloging and organizational systems developed at Alexandria influenced library science for centuries to come. The model of organizing knowledge by subject matter, of creating systematic lists of materials, of recognizing the need for multiple copies of important texts, of understanding that the arrangement of knowledge influenced how it was understood. All of these principles that had emerged in the library remained influential in how knowledge was organized and preserved in subsequent centuries. The Library of Alexandria represented in its essence a statement about the value of human knowledge and the obligation to preserve it. It demonstrated that knowledge, once preserved and made accessible, became the property of all humanity, accessible across generations and languages, transcending the limitations of individual human lifespans. This vision, so powerfully embodied in the library, has continued to inspire and guide efforts to preserve and share knowledge across all the centuries that have followed. The particular works that were preserved at Alexandria have shaped the entire course of Western intellectual history. The mathematical texts enshrined there provided the foundation for all subsequent mathematical development. The philosophical works ensured that the ideas of Plato and Aristotle remained accessible and influential across centuries. The medical and scientific works preserved the empirical observations of ancient scholars, creating a foundation upon which later investigators could build. The stories of the library's founding and its early centuries have themselves become part of human cultural memory. The vision of Ptolemy and his successors, of Zenodorus and Callimachus and the other great librarians, of the anonymous scribes and scholars who devoted their lives to the work of preservation. These have become emblematic of the human impulse to gather, preserve, and transmit knowledge across time. The library has become a symbol of what human civilization is capable of achieving when it dedicates resources and energy to the preservation of understanding. Even in its decline and ultimate loss, the Library of Alexandria continues to offer lessons. It teaches us about the vulnerability of accumulated knowledge, about the need for vigilance in preserving what has been gathered and created. It reminds us that knowledge requires not merely creation but preservation, that books and documents, however carefully made, are subject to deterioration and loss. It demonstrates the importance of creating multiple copies, of dispersing knowledge across different locations and communities, so that no single catastrophe can erase what humanity has learned. And so, across more than 2,000 years, the Library of Alexandria continues to resonate in human consciousness. It represents the great achievement of ancient scholarship, the dedication to knowledge for its own sake, and the belief that human understanding is worth preserving and transmitting across generations. Its legacy lives on in every library, every archive, every effort to gather and preserve human knowledge and wisdom. The 3 centuries of its operation, though distant in time, continue to illuminate our understanding of what is possible when humanity dedicates itself to the pursuit and preservation of understanding. In the gathering darkness of evening, as shadows lengthen across the stones of long-abandoned buildings, one might almost imagine the ghosts of those ancient scholars still moving through the chambers, still engaged in their patient work of copying and preserving. The scrolls that once filled the shelves have largely perished, their papyrus dissolved back into the dust from which it came. Yet the knowledge they contained did not perish. It was transmitted through copies, through translations, through the memories of those who read it and shared it. And so something of that great library persists still, in the books and documents and electronic records through which humanity continues its endless effort to gather, preserve, and transmit understanding. The weight of centuries presses gently upon your awareness now, the accumulated knowledge of ages settling like a soft blanket around your consciousness. The voices of ancient scholars seem to whisper from very far away, their work continuing in some timeless space beyond the reach of historical time. Your breathing slows and deepens. The boundaries between past and present grow dim and indistinct. And in the peaceful darkness, in the soft silence that surrounds you now, the great library of human knowledge exists still, vast and eternal and ever-present, waiting for those who will continue its endless work of understanding and remembrance. Word count, 5,978 words, within plus or minus 10% of 5,980.